At 9 in the morning on August 22nd, 1944, the most dangerous sound in the Italian Alps was silence. High above the Brenner Pass, one American fighter was not flying so much as falling, a heavy shape sliding out of thin air like a verdict. Captain Jack Reynolds sat inside a P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of armor and stubborn metal, a machine built to survive by making as much noise as possible. But now the engine was dead. The propeller that should have been a spinning blur was frozen in place, one blade pointing straight up like a signal flare nobody fired. Inside the cockpit there was no comforting thunder of horsepower, only wind, sharp and steady, scraping along the canopy. Only the faint creak of the wings as the aircraft shuddered through cold air. Reynolds could hear his own breath in the oxygen mask, too loud, too fast, as if his body was trying to talk him out of what his mind had already decided. Every lesson he had ever learned screamed one command: restart. A powerless Thunderbolt was not a glider. It was a falling anvil. If the engine refused to come back, there would be no second try, no gentle field, no emergency landing in this canyon of stone. There would be only granite coming up to meet him at 300 miles per hour. And yet his hand stayed away from the throttle, because Reynolds was not losing control. He was taking control in the only way the Brenner Pass still allowed. He had aimed the silent jug at the darkest target in the valley, a tunnel mouth cut into a cliff, guarded by guns that could shred a fighter in seconds. Guns that were already waiting for the sound of him. But there was no sound. Reynolds was betting his life on a simple truth. If they could not hear him, they could not kill him in time. The Brenner Pass was not just a valley. It was a lifeline. A narrow, twisting corridor that connected Austria to Italy, carrying the supplies that kept the German army in Italy breathing. Tanks, fuel, shells, spare parts, food, men. Everything that mattered rode through that pass on rails and roads. The Allies understood the arithmetic of war. Cut the pass and the German front would starve, fail, and American infantry would pay for it with blood and broken bodies on the Gothic line. The Germans understood it too. They turned the pass into a fortress, hardening every tunnel mouth, guarding bridges, rail yards, and choke points with layers of flak. Heavy 88mm guns burst high and wide, and quad 20mm cannons filled the lower air with churning lead. The valley forced attackers into a straight line, a narrow approach that left little room to dodge. American pilots called it the zipper. Fly into Brenner and the zipper shut. But the guns were only the visible teeth. The invisible trap was what came before the shooting. The Germans had built ears into the mountains. Along the ridges and near the batteries, they installed sound locators, giant paired metal horns that looked like industrial trumpets aimed at the sky. Primitive acoustic radar. They could pick up the rumble of a fighter engine from miles away, especially in a canyon where sound bounced off rock and returned stronger. Operators turned cranks, triangulated direction, and phoned the gun crews. By the time American planes reached a target, gunners were already seated, cigarettes out, eyes locked on the exact patch of sky where the attackers would appear. The train engineers knew the routine too. When sirens wailed, locomotives raced into tunnels carved from granite. A train inside a mountain was nearly untouchable. Bomb the cliff and the mountain absorbed it. Bomb the rails and repair crews fixed it. Again and again, American pilots flew long missions, survived flak, and arrived just in time to watch the last car vanish into darkness. They were fighting ghosts. Reynolds had watched friends die because the enemy had heard them coming. Each mission made the same point with a cruel clarity. Noise was warning. Warning was survival for the defender. Reynolds began to wonder what would happen if he took the warning away. The P-47 was the wrong tool for sneaking. It was huge, thick, and heavy, a flying tank with the aerodynamic charm of a grand piano. Pilots called it the Jug. It carried 8 machine guns and could haul bombs under its wings. It was tough enough to come home with damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Under the cowling lived a brutal 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. But power came with sound, and the Jug was loud, painfully loud. Its turbo screamed, its exhaust barked. In the Brenner Pass, that sound reached the German horns long before the plane reached the target. The Jug became its own betrayal. Reynolds could not stop thinking about it. How do you hide a monster from ears that live in the mountains? The answer came from something that had no engine at all. On a patrol, Reynolds watched a hawk hunting in a valley. It did not flap. It folded its wings and dropped, silent and fast, striking before the rabbit understood it was prey. The hawk did not announce itself. It became gravity and speed. Reynolds felt the idea form in his mind like a match struck in darkness. What if the Jug could become that? What if it could fall on the target without giving the valley time to wake up? He tested it behind Allied lines, away from orders and witnesses. He climbed to 12,000 feet and let the engine settle into a healthy hum. Then he reached for the mixture control and pulled it back to idle cutoff. The engine coughed, shuddered, and died. Silence hit the cockpit so hard it felt like impact. The nose dropped violently and Reynolds' stomach rose into his throat. The altimeter began to unwind fast, too fast. The Thunderbolt did not glide. It fell. The temptation to restart was immediate, almost physical. But Reynolds forced himself to keep the engine off and pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The airspeed climbed toward 300 miles per hour. The heavy fighter steadied, slicing through the air like a sled, and the world remained eerily quiet. He rode the silent dive for several miles, then shoved the mixture forward and hit the starter. The engine coughed, spat, and roared back to life. Reynolds pulled up just above the trees, hands shaking, heart hammering. It worked, but it felt like stealing from death. When he pitched the tactic to his commanding officer, the colonel looked at him like he had lost his mind. He called it suicide by physics. He reminded Reynolds that the P-47 had the glide ratio of a crowbar. He warned about radial engines cooling too fast, about failed restarts, about narrow valleys and granite cliffs. The tactic was banned. In the squadron, the jokes began. Paper airplanes on Reynolds' bunk, grins about a glider club. Reynolds let them laugh. The war did not care about laughter. The war cared about results. And Reynolds cared about the people dying because the enemy always heard them first. Reynolds kept practicing in secret, refining the difference between falling and controlled falling. During one test over open water, he discovered the hidden problem that almost killed the idea. When he cut the engine, the Thunderbolt bled speed too quickly. It felt as if an invisible hand was dragging the plane backward. Reynolds realized it was not only gravity punishing him, it was the propeller. With the engine dead, the blades sat in a fine pitch, flat to the wind, acting like a giant brake. The prop had become an air dam. Reynolds reached for the prop control and shoved it forward to course pitch. The blades twisted edge to the wind and the drag dropped. The Jug surged forward, still descending fast but now stable, controllable, lethal in its smoothness. Reynolds learned the numbers by feel. Keep the nose down. Keep the speed high. Start from 12,000 feet, and you could glide about 6 or 7 miles, enough to slip into the space where sound locators were most dangerous. He proved the concept once in combat, unauthorized, against a small convoy near a bridge. He cut the engine, dove in silence, and dropped a bomb before the drivers even understood they were being attacked. He restarted after the explosion. The minor victory was not the point. The point was the silence. He now knew the enemy had a blind spot shaped like quiet. Late in August, the target arrived like a nightmare with a deadline. Allied intelligence sent a warning to the airfield. A reconnaissance plane had spotted a heavy German train hauling around 30 cars of artillery shells, moving at night, hiding by day. If those shells reached the Gothic Line, American infantry would pay in thousands of lives. The report said the train was currently tucked inside a specific tunnel near a cliff-faced town, an entrance protected by a concrete overhang that shielded it from bombs dropped from above. You could not simply plaster the mountainside. The train would survive inside the rock. To destroy it, you had to get explosives into the tunnel mouth itself. The only technique that might work was skip bombing, dropping a bomb at a shallow angle so it bounced forward like a stone skimming water, except here, the surface would be rails and gravel. The tunnel was guarded by the nastiest flak position in the sector. 4 quad 20mm guns sat above the entrance with a clear view of the approach. Any plane coming within miles with its engine running would be heard by sound locators and met by a wall of lead. The colonel studied the map and the weather. Low clouds, high winds. Sending a full squadron into that canyon would be a slaughter. He needed a miracle. He needed someone crazy enough to try something that was not in the manual. He called Reynolds in and did not lecture him this time. He only pointed at the target and said the train had to be destroyed. Then, looking away as if he could not bear to see the risk in his own words, he added, "I do not care how you do it. Just do not tell me about the physics." On the flight line, ground crews loaded Reynolds' jug with 2 500-pound bombs, heavy, blunt shapes that made the Thunderbolt feel even more like a bus with wings. The crew chief asked about fuse settings. Reynolds chose delay, the kind that would allow the bomb to strike, bounce, and still travel before detonation. He did not explain the reason. The crew chief did not ask again. Nearby, Lieutenant Redmiller climbed into his own Thunderbolt and gave Reynolds a thumbs up. Miller was steady and loyal, the kind of wingman every leader wanted. He also did not know the plan. He thought this would be a standard dive-bombing run, with the engine screaming, the way the manuals taught. Engines started, and the field shook with that deep radial thunder. The sound was both comfort and violence, the heartbeat of American air power. Reynolds taxied with his eyes flicking again and again to the mixture control. That small lever was the switch between life and falling. In the air, climbing toward the pass, Reynolds kept his voice calm on the radio. He told Miller to stay high for cover and watch for fighters. He offered a simple lie about fuel conservation and a low-power approach. Miller sounded confused, but agreed. Reynolds did not want Miller down in the canyon when the zipper woke up. He wanted at least one of them to come home no matter what happened. The Brenner Pass opened ahead, jagged and narrow, peaks rising like teeth on both sides. Far above, black puffs from heavy flak searched for high-altitude bombers. Down in the valley, the real killers waited for the sound that always came before an attack. Spotters watched from ridges, men with binoculars who could turn a glint into a warning flare. Reynolds leveled at 12,000 feet. He checked his map. The tunnel was several miles ahead, carved into a cliff like a black wound. The engine hummed strong and warm. It wanted to live. Killing it felt like betrayal. But the noise echoed off the canyon walls, multiplied, and ran ahead of him like a messenger. Reynolds knew he was already being heard. This was the point where hesitation became death. He took a breath of cold oxygen, reached for the mixture control, and pulled it back to idle cutoff. The engine answered with a single harsh bang and went silent. The nose pitched down. Reynolds shoved the stick forward and slammed the prop control to coarse pitch. The blades twisted and the propeller slowed until it froze. Silence filled the cockpit. It was so complete he could hear the aircraft itself, the faint groans of stressed spars. He pushed the nose lower and felt speed build. 280. 300. 320. The jug became a heavy, smooth sled. He dropped below the peaks and into the canyon. Restarting now would throw noise against stone and wake every gunner within miles. He committed to the slide. Ahead, the tunnel mouth appeared, small at first, then growing. Above it, concrete bunkers and gun pits clung to rock. Reynolds could see barrels. He could see figures. The Germans were looking south, listening for a roar. They were not looking behind them for a silent fall. The first seconds were almost too good. The gunners below did not react. They stared into the distance, waiting for the sound that never came. Reynolds fought the controls, heavier without engine power feeding systems, and held the jug steady. Then sunlight betrayed him. A glint flashed off his canopy, and a spotter on a ridge snapped his head toward it. The spotter raised a flare pistol and fired a single red flare into the gray air. In the valley, heads turned. One flare meant aircraft sighted, not necessarily attack. The gunners hesitated, pointing, arguing, trying to match what they saw with what they heard. They heard nothing. Reynolds held his breath and used that hesitation. The tunnel grew larger in his sight. He saw the train now, steel cars snaking into darkness, the last several still outside, exposed. He did not want to simply hit the cars outside. That might damage rails and still leave shells inside the mountain. He needed bombs inside the tunnel, where pressure could turn the space into a weapon against itself. The spotter realized the shape was wrong, the direction wrong, the danger real. He fired again, then again, signaling a full attack. The valley woke in panic. Gunners scrambled into seats. Barrels swung. Quad 20s began to hammer the air, and heavy guns threw bursts into a box barrage, a cube of shrapnel meant to catch an incoming dive. But they aimed high. They assumed the attacker was roaring down from above. Habit guided their aim. Reynolds was not above. He was below, skimming treetops. Black bursts bloomed hundreds of feet over his canopy, while shrapnel rattled down on his wings. The main blast waves passed above him. He was surfing under a curtain of death. Now he was close enough to see faces. One German near the tracks finally looked down and saw it, a massive fighter sliding in silence. Too close, too fast. His mouth opened in shock. There was no time for him to make a sound that mattered. Reynolds watched his speed bleed and forced the nose down to keep it alive. Too slow, and the jug would stall and fall into the gun pits. Too fast, and the bombs would overshoot into the cliff above the tunnel mouth. He aimed for a spot on the rail bed just short of the entrance and held the approach steady. His hand hovered over the release. 200 yards. He pulled the lever. The thunderbolt lurched upward as the weight dropped away. Reynolds shoved the stick forward to keep level. He watched the bombs strike the ground hard and bounce, not detonating because of the delay. They skipped forward like stones, once, twice, then disappeared into the black mouth of the tunnel. They were inside. Reynolds did not look back. He had a new problem, closer and sharper. He was low, fast, and heading straight for a granite wall, and his engine was still dead. This was the bill physics came to collect. He slammed the mixture forward, pushed the throttle, hit the starter. Nothing. The starter whined, fighting the frozen prop in coarse pitch. The blades turned slowly. The engine did not catch. The cliff filled his windshield, and the details of death became clear, cracks in stone, lines of ice, the hard certainty of impact. Reynolds shouted inside his mask and pumped the primer, forcing fuel into stubborn cylinders. Start. One cylinder fired. A cough. Then another. Then the engine caught, roaring back to life with a violent vibration that shook the airframe. The prop blurred. Reynolds yanked the prop control toward fine pitch, and the engine surged, screaming at emergency power. Torque twisted the plane left. Reynolds stamped the rudder and hauled back on the stick. The jug climbed hard, clearing the flak position by inches and going nearly vertical up the cliff face. Behind him, inside the tunnel, the bombs detonated. Their blast triggered the first car of artillery shells. That car detonated the next, and the next. The chain reaction ran through the train with unstoppable speed. Pressure had nowhere to go inside rock. The tunnel became a cannon barrel. Flame erupted from the entrance in a violent orange tongue. Concrete shattered. Cars still outside were lifted and thrown across the valley. The flak position that had guarded the mouth for years was erased in an instant. Men who had been looking at the sky vanished without ever hearing the engine until it was already climbing away above them. High above, Red Miller saw the mountain explode. He had watched Reynolds disappear into the canyon and expected a fireball, a crash, a final bright dot of death. Instead, the cliff bloomed into smoke and dust, rising higher than the canyon walls. A moment later, the silver jug burst out of the haze, climbing like something reborn. Miller keyed his microphone, voice shaking. "Good Lord, Jack. You did not just hit the tunnel. You moved the mountain." Reynolds did not answer right away. His hands trembled on the controls, and his mind was still staring at granite from a distance of inches. He dialed back the power, checked the gauges, and forced his breathing to slow. Everything read green. The beast was alive. At 15,000 feet, he finally spoke, voice dry but steady. "Target destroyed. Let's go home, Red." The flight back was quiet. Reynolds did not roll or celebrate. He flew straight, listening to the engine hum with a kind of gratitude he had never felt before. On the ground, he shut down, and the propeller spun to a stop. Silence returned, but this time it was safe. He climbed out, soaked in sweat, legs weak, and sat on the wing for a moment, simply breathing. The colonel's jeep arrived fast. The colonel jumped out, looked at the empty bomb racks, looked at Miller's frantic gestures, and then looked at Reynolds. His face tried to be stern. His voice could not fully hide relief. "Did you survive the physics?" Reynolds lit a cigarette with shaking hands and managed a small smile. "Physics worked fine, Colonel. Gravity did most of the work. I just steered." The colonel stared at him, then at the jug, then toward the distant mountains where smoke still clawed at the sky. "Do not ever do it again," he said. Then, quieter, "Good job." The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, worried about rapid cooling cracking the radial engine. The crew chief opened panels, checked lines, ran hands over cylinder heads, and finally nodded. The engine had taken the abuse. Tough American iron. The real proof came from the gun camera film. In a darkened briefing tent, the projector clicked and the screen flickered. Grainy black and white showed the dive into the valley. It showed flak bursts blooming like silent flowers. And it showed the propeller. Not blurred, not turning, frozen in flight. The room went quiet in a different way. The colonel watched the last frame, then set down his coffee as if it suddenly tasted like facts. You could not ban a weapon that worked, not entirely. It would never become standard, too dangerous, too many ways to die. But it would be remembered, passed along, used when targets were impossible and the zipper was too tight. In the months that followed, the idea spread through pilots who understood that sound could be a chain, and silence could be a knife. When flak was too thick and sound locators made every approach predictable, a few would climb high, cut the mixture, twist the prop to course, and become ghosts sliding into the valley without a roar. The Germans checked their equipment and blamed operators. Some imagined a new silent engine. They never guessed the truth was simpler and more terrifying. A man was turning off his own heartbeat on purpose. Reynolds finished his tour not long after. No parade waited for a pilot who bombed tunnels in Italy. The war was too large for that, too crowded with louder headlines. He went home, traded uniform for a suit, became an engineer, lived quietly. When asked what he did, he usually said only that he flew fighters. He did not explain the glide, the frozen propeller, the cliff face filling the windshield. How do you explain that the most terrifying moment of your life was quiet? How do you tell someone that courage can sound like wind and nothing else? He died years later, and at his funeral, a few old men stood close together, leather jackets hanging loose on thin shoulders. They talked about cold tents and bad coffee, and engines that always demanded more. Red Miller raised a glass, and his voice cracked as memory pulled him backward into a canyon of stone and silence. To Jack, he said, the only pilot I ever knew who could shut up long enough to win a war. Today the P-47 hangs in museums, a brute of metal and horsepower. People look at it and imagine roar. They do not imagine the propeller frozen. They do not imagine a tank becoming a hawk. They do not imagine a man reaching for a lever and choosing silence over comfort, trusting gravity to carry him into the valley and out again. History is loud, but sometimes the turning point is quiet. Sometimes victory belongs to the one who knows exactly when to stop making noise.